A gate nobody locked. A canal nobody guarded. A cliff path nobody thought a man could climb, with a cannon on his back. A latrine shaft nobody thought an enemy would crawl through in the dark. Watch what happens next. A chief engineer stands on a rampart and tells his king this wall cannot be taken. 3 weeks later, the same wall is a smoking gap and the king is in chains. A general points to a line of concrete forts stretching to the horizon and says the war stops here, permanently, on paper, in briefings, in every newspaper in the capital. The enemy just drives around it. Through the one stretch of forest, the map's called impossible. 27 fortresses. 27 men who said it can't fail, who staked careers, dynasties, and sometimes entire nations on that sentence. Every single one of these actually happened, documented in siege logs, court-martial transcripts, and the memoirs of men who watched it happen from the wrong side of the wall. Some fell to an army. Most fell to a detail somebody was too proud to check, a door left unbarred, a payroll left unpaid, a slope somebody swore no cannon could climb. Stick around for the one where the defenders sold their own castle for unpaid wages, and the one where a captured letter with a forged signature did more damage than 100 siege engines. Number 1. For 11 centuries, the Theodosian Walls had done exactly one job: make Constantinople unconquerable. Triple ring, moat, 60-foot towers, built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II and reinforced every single time somebody tried them, patched after earthquakes, after Avar sieges, after Arab sieges, after 400 years of Ottoman probing. Nobody had taken this city by force, ever. Constantine XI had maybe 8,000 defenders scattered across 12 miles of wall, a garrison so thin that in places a single soldier stood every few yards. Sultan Mehmed II showed up with somewhere north of 60,000 men, and a bronze cannon so large it took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to drag it into position. A gun cast by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines and been turned away for lack of funds. For 53 days the walls held. Ottoman guns cracked stone, defenders patched it back with wood, earthen fill and rubble overnight under torchlight, while cannonballs still smoked in the breach, and the line did not break. Night after night, exhausted men worked in shifts, dragging timber frames into gaps, while Ottoman drums beat somewhere in the dark beyond the moat. A constant psychological pressure meant to fray nerves before a single shot was fired the next morning. Then somebody in the city forgot to bar a small service gate called the Kirka, a postern meant for quick sorties, not a siege, tucked into a section of the wall considered too minor to warrant a dedicated watch. Ottoman soldiers found it standing open, walked through, and raised their banner on the inner wall before the garrison even understood what had happened. Word spread through the defenders in minutes, a rumor at first, then a confirmed horror, and the psychological collapse that followed did more damage than the breach itself. Constantine XI reportedly tore off his imperial regalia so he would not be recognized and captured alive, and vanished into the melee near the gate. His body was never conclusively identified afterward. The wall that had outlasted 1,100 years of history fell because of a door somebody forgot to close, on a night when every other section of that same wall was still holding. The Byzantines built for a 1,000-year siege and lost to a doorknob. British planners spent 2 decades and millions of pounds turning Singapore into the Gibraltar of the East. Enormous coastal guns, some firing shells nearly a foot in diameter, a naval base built to outlast any fleet on Earth, dry docks and fuel depots stocked for a prolonged siege. Winston Churchill called it impregnable in public, and meant it, telling Parliament the fortress would hold no matter what came at it from the water. There was one detail nobody in London wanted to think about too hard. The guns pointed out to sea, because nobody believed an army could come at Singapore from behind, through hundreds of miles of Malayan jungle that colonial planners had spent decades describing as an impenetrable natural barrier in its own right. General Yamashita's troops did exactly that. Bicycle infantry, traveling light, moving faster than anyone thought possible through terrain British planners had written off as impassable, covering roughly the length of Malaya in under 2 months, while riding requisitioned bicycles down plantation roads and jungle trails. They rolled down the peninsula while the fortress guns sat aimed at an empty ocean, some of them physically unable to traverse far enough inland to engage a landward threat at all. By the time Yamashita reached the causeway, Singapore had no real defense on its landward side, and water reserves inside the city were already running dangerously low under the strain of a swollen wartime population. On February 15, 1942, roughly 130,000 Commonwealth troops surrendered, in what remains the largest capitulation in British military history. Churchill later called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, a phrase he reportedly struggled even to say aloud in the House of Commons. Singapore built a wall against the sea. The army came in on bicycles. Named for War Minister André Maginot, a veteran of Verdun who had personally seen what unprotected trenches cost in human life, this was France's answer to the trenches of the last war. A chain of concrete forts, gun turrets, underground barracks, and even air-conditioned troop quarters running along the German border, built through the 1930s at a cost of billions of francs, a sum that consumed a staggering share of the interwar military budget. French generals told their own parliament that the line made a second German invasion effectively impossible, and for years the public treated it as a settled fact, a source of genuine national reassurance printed on postcards and newsreels. They were right about the line itself. It was the ground beside it that failed. Planners considered the Ardennes forest too dense and its roads too poor for tanks to pass in any meaningful force, so they left it lightly defended by second-line reserve divisions and put their confidence in the concrete further north and south. German General Erich von Manstein pushed armor straight through those impassable trees anyway, funneling 7 panzer divisions down narrow forest roads in a traffic jam so long it stretched back for miles, a gamble that depended entirely on French reconnaissance not looking closely enough to notice. Within days, German panzers were behind the entire fortification, in open country, racing toward the English Channel and then Paris, while French command structures, built for a slower, more static war, simply could not react in time. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The line itself was barely touched by a direct assault, its garrisons in some sectors still fully intact and unbeaten when the armistice was signed, because the invasion simply went around it. France spent a fortune making sure lightning wouldn't strike the same place twice. It struck next door. Belgian military intelligence spent the rest of 1940 trying to reconstruct exactly what happened on the roof of Eben Emael, and the surviving fragments of that inquiry read like a confession nobody wanted to write. A captured Belgian NCO, interrogated separately by both his own command and, later, by German officers cataloging the operation for their own training manuals, described watching gliders drift down out of a moonless sky with their engines already cut, silent enough that sentries mistook the sound for wind moving through the anti-aircraft cabling strung across the roof. Nobody had ever rehearsed a scenario where the enemy simply arrived from directly overhead. The fort's own defense plan, filed and stamped only months earlier, listed threats from the canal, from the roads, from infiltration through the surrounding farmland, and nothing at all about the open concrete roof 600 feet above the Albert Canal. German engineers, debriefed after the war for Allied historians piecing together the operation, described the shaped charges almost clinically, noting that a garrison built to repel tanks and infantry had no procedure whatsoever for an enemy standing directly on top of a gun cupola with a demolition charge in his hands. The captured radio logs recovered from the fort show requests for reinforcement going out in the first 10 minutes of the attack and simply stopping, mid-transmission, the record ending exactly where the shaped charges started punching through steel that had never been designed to be attacked from above. Belgium's engineers called Eben Emael the strongest fort in Europe, a concrete monster, guarding the Albert Canal with steel cupolas, retractable gun turrets, and 1,200 men inside, supported by extensive underground barracks and ammunition stores, meant to sustain a siege of weeks. Every gun was sighted to shred an army approaching by land or water, with overlapping fields of fire calculated down to the meter by pre-war engineers who considered the design essentially unbeatable by conventional means. What the designers never planned for was an enemy landing directly on top of the fort in total silence, on gliders that made almost no noise at all as they came down. At dawn on May 10, 1940, German gliders cut their engines miles from the target and drifted down onto the fortress roof, delivering roughly 80 combat engineers of the specialist unit Sturmabteilung Koch, armed with a brand new weapon, the shaped charge, a device most of the defenders inside had never even heard of. They blew open gun cupolas from above before the garrison of 1,200 fully understood they were under attack, moving from position to position across the open roof, while Belgian gunners below could do nothing but fire blind through gun slits designed to face outward, never upward. Belgian troops tried to fight back inside their own fort, in corridors and stairwells built to keep enemies out, not in, disoriented by explosions coming from directions the fort's own architecture had never anticipated. By the next day, Ibn Email surrendered, and the operation became a case study taught in military academies for decades afterward as the textbook example of vertical envelopment. 85 men beat 1,200 because nobody built a roof to stop a landing party. Herod the Great built his mountain palace as the ultimate bolt hole, a plateau fortress with sheer cliffs on every side, cisterns cut deep into the rock, storehouses stocked with grain, oil, and wine meant to outlast any siege for years if necessary, and a palace complex so lavish it doubled as a statement of untouchable power. Decades later, Jewish rebels known as the Sicarii held it against Rome itself, betting that no legion would bother building a way up a 900-foot rock in the middle of the Judean desert, a wager that made sense against any army in the ancient world except the one Rome actually was. The Roman 10th Legion bothered. Under Flavius Silva, thousands of soldiers and slave laborers spent months constructing a massive earthen ramp up the western face of the mountain, a project so enormous and so methodically engineered that its remains are still visible today, nearly 2,000 years later, baked into the desert landscape as a permanent monument to Roman patience. Once the ramp reached the wall, Roman siege engines rolled forward, including a heavily armored siege tower, and breached it after a sustained bombardment. According to the historian Josephus, the defenders, roughly 960 men, women, and children, chose mass suicide over capture rather than face what came next, drawing lots in a final act, described in vivid and disputed detail by ancient sources. Rome didn't storm the mountain. Rome just built its own mountain next to it. Richard the Lionheart called this his saucy castle, and boasted it could be held by a garrison of straw men, a fortress built in under 2 years, using an innovative concentric design that put 3 separate rings of defense between an attacker and the keep. Concentric walls, a moat carved from solid rock at enormous expense in labor, positioned to block any advance up the Seine into Normandy and guard the approach to Rouen itself. When Philip II of France besieged it in 1203, with Richard already dead and Norman morale faltering, defenders under Roger de Lacy expected the walls to do all the work, trusting in a design Richard himself had called perfect. French engineers found what nobody had bothered to guard, a garderobe shaft, essentially a latrine chute, running down through the chapel wall into an unguarded corner of the inner bailey. A small party of French soldiers climbed up through it in the dark, filthy and freezing, and opened a gate from the inside before the sleeping garrison had any warning at all. The garrison, blindsided by an attack from within its own supposedly sealed fortress, fell back room by room, losing one ring of defense after another, until the castle surrendered in March 1204, after a siege that had dragged on for the better part of a year. That was the first stupid thing. Nobody blocked the shaft. The second stupid thing was assuming an enemy wouldn't check every possible way in, no matter how undignified. Richard built the strongest castle in Normandy. France walked in through the plumbing. The Knights Hospitaller built Crac des Chevaliers into a concentric fortress in Syria so formidable it held for over 150 years against everything the region could throw at it, surviving direct assault, prolonged siege, and even an earthquake in 1170 that damaged part of the structure without ever compromising the garrison's ability to hold. Double walls, a garrison that never numbered more than a few thousand men, and a reputation strong enough that the Mamluk Sultan Baybars reportedly preferred not to test it directly after seeing what a costly frontal assault would likely cost his army. Instead, Baybars forged a letter, supposedly from the Hospitaler's own Grand Master in Tripoli, instructing the garrison to surrender, complete with a seal convincing enough that nobody inside the walls thought to question its authenticity in the exhausted, isolated state the siege had left them in. The defenders, worn down after weeks of bombardment and cut off from any real communication with their own order, believed it entirely. They opened the gates without another fight, walked out under safe conduct as promised, and handed over one of the most formidable castles in the Crusader world, without Baybars losing another soldier to the walls that had defeated so many before him. What could possibly go wrong with trusting an unverified letter during a siege, arriving at exactly the moment morale had nowhere left to go but down? Everything, apparently. The Hospitallers built walls no army could crack. A forged signature did it instead. After losing their footholds on the mainland, the Knights Hospitaller rebuilt their power on roads, ringing the city with walls so advanced, incorporating the latest in artillery-resistant angled bastions, they'd already beaten back an Ottoman siege in 1480 that had cost the Sultan's forces heavy casualties for nothing. By 1522, the Knights were confident enough to dismiss Suleiman the Magnificent's new army as another failed attempt in the making, a repeat performance of an old humiliation. Suleiman came with more than 100,000 men, heavy artillery, far more advanced than anything used in 1480, and engineers who tunneled beneath the walls to plant mines rather than waste men on frontal assault against bastions that had already proven their worth. The siege dragged on for nearly 6 months of relentless mining, countermining, and bombardment, with both sides fighting through tunnels as much as over walls. Breach after breach opened faster than the Knights, exhausted and dwindling in number, could seal them, and by December 1522, the Grand Master negotiated a surrender on terms that allowed the surviving Knights to evacuate with their weapons and relics intact, eventually resettling on Malta. Rhodes had already beaten one siege. It just hadn't met an army willing to dig for half a year without stopping. Marienburg, the largest Gothic castle ever built, sprawling across acres along the Nogat River, was headquarters of the Teutonic Knights, and a statement in brick that the order intended to rule the Baltic forever, its Grand Master's residence alone rivaling any royal palace in Europe. During the 13 Years' War against Poland, the castle held firm against every direct assault the Polish crown could muster. The problem wasn't the walls, which never truly failed. It was payroll, a far less glamorous vulnerability than any siege engine. The Teutonic Order had hired Bohemian mercenaries to hold Malbork and simply ran out of money to pay them as the war dragged on and the Order's finances collapsed under the strain. Rather than storm the fortress, which everyone agreed would be brutally costly, the Polish king Casimir IV did something far simpler. He paid the mercenaries overdue wages himself, reportedly around 190,000 guilders, a sum the cash-strapped order simply could not match. The soldiers, who had been guarding the castle for a paycheck rather than a cause and had gone unpaid for months, handed over the keys in 1457 and walked away with their debts settled by the enemy. The Teutonic Knights built a fortress no army could take. Then they forgot to pay the men guarding it. American revolutionaries called Ticonderoga the Gibraltar of the New World after seizing it in a surprise raid in 1775, led in part by Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys, catching the small British garrison completely off guard in the middle of the night. By 1777, the garrison guarding it against a returning British army believed the position secure, in large part because a nearby height called Sugarloaf Hill, later Mount Defiance, was considered too steep and too remote for anyone to drag artillery up in any usable time frame. British General John Burgoyne's engineers disagreed, and a young British lieutenant reportedly scouted the summit himself and reported back that guns could indeed be placed there with enough effort. Overnight, soldiers hauled cannon up Mount Defiance, using block and tackle, in a grueling, exhausting operation, completed in remarkably short order, and by morning, American defenders looked up to see British guns staring straight down into their fort, close enough to hit any position inside with ease. There was no need for a bombardment. The American garrison, suddenly and completely exposed, with nowhere to shelter from plunging fire, abandoned Ticonderoga without firing a shot and slipped away across the lake in the night, leaving supplies behind in their haste. The fort never fell in battle. It fell because nobody thought a cannon could get up a hill. The French governor Montcalm considered Quebec effectively unassailable from the riverside, protected by cliffs he judged too steep for any army to climb, let alone in the dark, let alone with equipment, let alone in complete silence past French sentries posted along the shoreline. British General James Wolfe had spent a summer failing to break the city any other way, exhausting his army in a costly and unsuccessful assault at Beauport, and time was running out before the St. Lawrence froze and the entire campaign season was lost. Wolfe found a narrow, lightly guarded path at a cove called Anse au Foulon, guarded by a small French picket that was reportedly deceived by British boats using French passwords obtained from a captured deserter, and moved thousands of men up it overnight, forming battle lines on the Plains of Abraham by dawn while the city still slept unaware. Montcalm, believing the real threat lay elsewhere and reportedly refusing to wait for reinforcements already marching toward the city, was caught completely off balance and rushed troops into a pitched battle rather than waiting behind the walls where his numbers and position would have favored him. Both commanders were mortally wounded in the fighting that followed, Wolfe dying on the field itself before the battle had even fully concluded. Quebec surrendered days later. Montcalm guarded every road into Quebec. Wolfe found the one path that wasn't a road. Babylon's walls were listed among the wonders of the ancient world by later Greek writers, thick enough for chariots to race along the top according to Herodotus's likely exaggerated account, and the city treated the Euphrates running through its center as another line of defense rather than a weakness, with massive bronze gates sealing the river's path where it entered and exited the walls. King Nabonidus and his court reportedly believed the position so strong that a siege wasn't even worth losing sleep over, and Nabonidus himself was famously absent from the city for long stretches, more interested in religious reforms than military preparation. Cyrus the Great's engineers diverted the Euphrates upstream into a marsh basin, dropping the river level low enough that Persian soldiers could wade in along the exposed riverbed, right under the walls, during a night of festival when the city's guard was down and much of the population, according to ancient accounts, was engaged in drunken celebration. According to Herodotus, the Persians were inside the city before most of Babylon even realized an army had arrived, moving through streets lit only by festival torches. There was barely a fight for the walls themselves, because the invasion never went over them, and the outlying districts reportedly fell before news even reached the city center. Babylon built its defense around a river. The river was the way in. By the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage's triple walls had already survived generations of conflict with Rome, walls so thick that later Roman accounts describe stables and barracks built directly inside them, and the city's leadership gambled that Rome, exhausted from decades of fighting elsewhere across the Mediterranean, wouldn't commit to another full siege over a rival it had already crippled economically. Rome committed anyway, sending Scipio Aemilianus with orders that made the goal unmistakable. Not conquest, but erasure. Roman forces sealed off the harbor, cutting Carthage's lifeline to food and reinforcement with a massive engineering project that blocked the sea approach entirely, and settled in for a siege that ground the city down through starvation before a single wall was breached, reducing a once wealthy metropolis to desperation over the course of roughly 2 years. When Roman troops finally forced their way in, the fighting continued street by street, house by house, for close to a week, with soldiers reportedly clearing buildings floor by floor against defenders who had nothing left to lose. Carthage was burned, its walls torn down, and the site left, according to later tradition, deliberately unusable, though modern historians debate how literally the famous salting of the earth actually happened. Carthage bet Rome had run out of patience. Rome had exactly enough left. Long before it became a symbol, the Bastille was simply a medieval fortress, 8 towers and walls nearly 100 feet high, built in the 14th century to guard the eastern approach to Paris, and later repurposed as a royal prison, holding a garrison of invalides, aging veteran soldiers, and a small detachment of Swiss guards. Governor Bernard René Delaunay had cannon on the walls and a position considered, almost as an afterthought, simply too old and too strong to be taken by a mob without proper siege equipment, since no crowd in living memory had ever managed to force entry into a royal fortress. On the morning of July 14, 1789, a crowd gathered outside seeking gunpowder stored within, and negotiations dragged through the morning without resolution, while tension in the courtyard climbed toward something neither side fully controlled. When firing broke out, accounts differ on who fired first, but the crowd, reinforced by mutinous French guards who brought actual cannon of their own, pressed the assault through the afternoon against a garrison that numbered barely more than 100 men. Delaunay, facing a swelling crowd and a garrison with dwindling resolve, agreed to surrender in exchange for safe passage, a promise the mob did not honor. He was dragged through the streets and killed before he ever reached City Hall, his head paraded on a pike as evidence of how completely the old order's authority had evaporated in a single afternoon. A medieval fortress, built to withstand armies, fell to a crowd with borrowed cannon and nowhere left to be patient. We've covered a door, a jungle, a forged letter, a river turned into a weapon, and a mob that simply refused to leave. Here's the layer nobody expects. This pattern doesn't stop at the Middle Ages, and it doesn't stop with the Bastille either. It runs straight into the First World War, wearing concrete and steel instead of stone. Fort Sumter sat on an artificial island in Charleston Harbor, a brick pentagon designed to command the entire approach with heavy coastal guns mounted in tiers, built as part of a coastal defense system that had cost the federal government years and enormous sums to construct. On paper, it was one of the strongest points in the American coastal defense system. In practice, by the spring of 1861, it was undermanned, undersupplied, and surrounded by newly built Confederate batteries on every side, batteries that had gone up in plain view over the preceding weeks while Washington debated how to respond. Major Robert Anderson had barely 80 men and dwindling rations, having relocated his small garrison from the more exposed Fort Moultrie in a midnight move months earlier, specifically because Sumter looked stronger, when Confederate forces opened fire on April 12, 1861. For 34 hours, shells rained down on a fort that had never been fully garrisoned or resupplied in time, its walls absorbing hit after hit, while the men inside rationed what little food remained. Anderson's men fired back with what little they had, before running low on powder and food, at one point improvising cartridge bags from spare clothing when supplies ran short. He surrendered the next day, remarkably without a single fatality on either side during the bombardment itself, and the shots fired at Sumter became the opening moment of the American Civil War. A fortress built to guard a harbor couldn't even guard its own supply line. Shanhai Pass marked the point where the Great Wall met the sea, considered the strongest and most heavily garrisoned link in China's entire border defense. A choke point so critical that dynasties had poured resources into it for centuries, specifically because it was the one gap wide enough for a major army to pass through. For centuries it had done its job, keeping the armies of the north out of the empire. In 1644 it was held by the Ming general Wu Sangui, and its reputation alone was supposed to guarantee the dynasty's survival, even as the dynasty itself was collapsing from within. Wu Sangui was fighting a rebel army led by Li Zicheng, which had already taken Beijing and driven the last Ming emperor to suicide, leaving Wu caught between two enemies with a single fortified pass as his only real bargaining chip. Rather than lose everything, he made a decision that undid 2,000 years of wall building in an afternoon. He opened the gates at Shanhai Pass and invited the Manchu Qing army through to help him fight the rebels. A calculated gamble he almost certainly believed he could control. The Qing came through, defeated Li Zicheng decisively, and then simply kept going, founding a new dynasty that would rule China for the next 2.5 centuries, while Wu Sangui himself spent the rest of his career serving the very power he had let in the door. China's wall never failed to keep an army out. A general just let one in. The Inca fortress above Cusco was built from stone blocks so massive, some weighing well over 100 tons, and so precisely fitted without mortar that later observers assumed no army could ever force its way through the walls, a defensive design that had already withstood the elements and minor conflicts for generations. During the Great Rebellion against Spanish rule, Manco Inca's forces used it as their stronghold, confident the position could hold against the smaller Spanish force below, which numbered only a fraction of the defenders inside. Spanish cavalry under Juan Pizarro found a section of wall where the defenses were thinner and forced a breach after brutal close fighting that stretched across days of assault and counter-assault along the terraces. One of the Inca commanders defending the central tower, remembered as Kawidi, reportedly chose to leap from the tower rather than surrender once the position was lost, a moment later commemorated in Peruvian national memory as an act of final defiance. Sacsayhuaman fell, and with it went the rebellion's best fortified position in the region, forcing Manco Inca to retreat and continue the resistance from more remote mountain strongholds. The stones at Sacsayhuaman still don't need mortar. They just needed more men behind them. Built on an island in a lake and connected to the mainland by a handful of causeways that could be raised or cut in an emergency, the Aztec capital had every reason to believe water was its best defense. A city of tens of thousands whose very geography made a conventional land assault nearly unworkable. No army could simply march in. Cortés understood this too, which is why he spent months building brigantines in sections inland and hauling them piece by piece to the lake, rather than trying to force his way across the causeways on foot against a hostile population that outnumbered his forces many times over. Once his ships controlled the lake, Cortés cut off the aqueduct at Chapultepec that supplied Tenochtitlan's fresh water, forcing residents to rely on brackish lake water that spread illness through the crowded city and blockaded every route in or out with ruthless consistency. What followed was a 93-day siege that starved the city as much as any assault weakened it, compounded by a smallpox epidemic that had already torn through the population before the final assault even began. Disease, hunger, and street-by-street fighting ground the defense down until Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec ruler, was captured trying to escape by canoe across the lake, ending organized resistance in the capital. Tenochtitlan's lake kept armies out. It couldn't keep the water in Aztec hands. The Dutch East India Company built Fort Zeelandia on Taiwan as the anchor of their entire East Asian trade network. A heavily bastioned complex confident its walls and cannon could outlast any regional power that came calling, backed by decades of profitable trade that funded continual upgrades to its defenses. When the Ming loyalist commander Koxinga arrived with a fleet in 1661, carrying an army several times the size of the Dutch garrison, Dutch Governor Frederik Coyet expected the same result as every previous standoff. A long siege the fort would simply outlast through supply by sea. A Dutch defector named Hans Radis crossed over to Koxinga's side and reportedly revealed weak points in the fort's defenses, including a poorly protected redoubt called Utrecht that commanded high ground overlooking the main fortification, information that proved devastating once Koxinga's gunners put it to use. Koxinga's forces used the information to tighten the siege and cut off Dutch reinforcements, eventually capturing the redoubt and using it to bombard the main fort directly from above. After 9 months, with no relief in sight, disease spreading through the starving garrison, and the exhausted defenders offered generous terms, Coyet surrendered in February 1662, ending Dutch rule on the island and a chapter of colonial history that had lasted nearly 4 decades. The fort held against Koxinga's army for months. It couldn't hold against one of its own defectors. Belgian engineer Henri Alexis Brialmont designed the Ring of 12 forts around Liège to be the most modern fortifications on the continent. Steel and concrete works considered proof against any siege gun in existence at the time they were built decades earlier, positioned to cover every road and rail line an invading army might use. When Germany invaded in August 1914, Belgian commanders genuinely believed the forts could delay the entire German war plan long enough for French and British forces to mobilize and respond. Germany brought guns nobody expected. Krupp's 420mm howitzer, nicknamed Big Bertha, and Skoda 305mm mortars, borrowed from Austria-Hungary. Shells the forts had never been designed to absorb because no such weapons existed when Brialmont drew his plans. Fort after fort was pounded into rubble within days, concrete cracking and collapsing under a scale of firepower that hadn't existed when the forts were designed decades earlier, with some garrisons reportedly driven to the edge of madness by the concussive shock of direct hits before the walls finally gave way. Liège fell by August 16th, just 12 days after the invasion began, though isolated forts held out defiantly even after the city itself was effectively lost. That sounds fake even when it's completely real. The strongest forts in Europe, cracked open in under 2 weeks by guns built after the walls were. As German forces swept through Belgium in 1914, the government retreated to Antwerp, a fortress city ringed with forts considered the nation's last unbreakable line, its designated national redoubt, and the place where the Belgian court, treasury, and government archives were all deliberately relocated for safekeeping. Officials moved records, gold reserves, and the seat of government there, specifically because the fortifications were supposed to make the city safe long enough to outlast the German advance elsewhere. The same German siege artillery that had leveled Liège arrived at Antwerp next, hauled overland in a logistical effort that itself demonstrated how seriously Germany took the obstacle. Big Bertha and its counterparts pounded the outer forts into submission over a 12-day bombardment that could be heard, according to some accounts, from miles away. Belgian defenses, designed for a previous generation of siege warfare built around the assumption that no gun could reach them from beyond their own range, simply had no answer to guns built to level cities from a safe distance. Antwerp fell in October 1914, forcing the Belgian field army into a fighting retreat westward toward the coast, and much of the government fled into exile. Belgium built its last stronghold around forts already obsolete before the first shell landed. Russia's Novogeorgievsk fortress complex was one of the largest fortified positions on Earth, garrisoned by more than 90,000 men with over 1,600 guns spread across a ring of forts along the Vistula and Narew rivers, and confidently nicknamed the Verdun of the East by Russian planners who saw it as an unbreakable anchor. Imperial commanders treated it as a guaranteed strongpoint against any German advance into Poland, pouring resources into it even as the broader Eastern Front situation deteriorated around it. German 8th and 9th Army units besieged the fortress with heavy guns in the summer of 1915, and within about 10 days the entire position collapsed in a manner that stunned observers on both sides, given its enormous garrison and armament. The fortress commander, General Bobeer, was later accused of incompetence and possibly worse, and reportedly abandoned his post during the chaos, fleeing while his own subordinates were still trying to organize a defense. Roughly 85,000 Russian troops surrendered, the single largest capitulation the Russian army suffered during the entire war, a collapse that fed directly into the broader crisis of confidence in Russian military leadership. 90,000 men and 1,600 guns fell in 10 days. The fortress didn't run out of firepower. It ran out of leadership. Austro-Hungarian planners called Przemyśl one of the most heavily fortified places in Europe. A ring of forts in Galicia meant to anchor the empire's eastern frontier against Russia indefinitely, built up over decades with the latest advances in fortification design available to the empire. When Russian forces besieged it, the garrison of well over 100,000 men was expected to hold for as long as it took, and for a time it did exactly that, repelling assaults and grinding down the besieging army in costly attacks. The forts held against direct assault. Starvation didn't care. As the siege dragged into its 5th month, defenders were reduced to eating cavalry horses to survive, then reportedly resorting to even more desperate measures as supplies ran completely dry, and morale collapsed alongside the food supply amid rumors, some true, of relief columns that never arrived. In March 1915, with no relief force able to break through despite repeated Austro-Hungarian attempts, the garrison surrendered, handing Russia one of the largest single hauls of prisoners and guns of the entire war, and a major propaganda blow to Austria-Hungary that reverberated through Allied capitals. Przemyśl's walls never broke. Its stomachs did first. Sevastopol had already withstood nearly a year of siege by the time French and British forces set their sights on the Malakoff, a fortified earthwork redoubt that Russian engineers considered the linchpin of the entire southern defense line, reinforced repeatedly as previous assaults had bled attacking forces white without gaining ground. Russian commanders believed the position could absorb any single assault the Allies threw at it, having already done exactly that on multiple prior occasions with heavy Allied casualties to show for it. French reconnaissance, watching the redoubt for weeks through careful, patient observation of garrison movements, noticed a pattern. Russian troops rotated shifts at a predictable hour each day, leaving the position briefly undermanned during the changeover. On September 8, 1855, French General McMahon timed his assault to strike during exactly that window, and troops poured over the parapet before the incoming shift had fully settled into position, overwhelming the reduced garrison in a matter of minutes rather than the hours previous assaults had taken. The fall of the Malakoff made the rest of the Sevastopol defense untenable, and Russian forces evacuated the city that same night, blowing up their own fortifications and scuttling ships in the harbor rather than let them fall intact. The Malakoff had survived every attack aimed at its walls. It never survived being watched closely enough to learn its own schedule. Fort Douaumont was the largest and highest fort in the ring around Verdun, and French commanders genuinely believed it to be the strongest single point on the entire Western Front, a masonry and concrete complex reinforced repeatedly since it was first built decades earlier. That reputation became its downfall. To reinforce trench lines elsewhere after the fort had gone quiet for months without seeing combat, the French had quietly stripped much of Douaumont's garrison and guns, leaving what should have been the war's most formidable fort thinly defended by little more than a skeleton crew. On February 25, 1916, a small German raiding party, numbering only around a couple dozen men at the point of entry, found an unguarded entrance, a tunnel connecting to the fort's interior that nobody had thought to seal or watch, and simply walked in through it, while the handful of French soldiers still inside had no idea an attack was underway at all. There was barely a fight. Douaumont, the crown jewel of the Verdun defenses, fell to a handful of soldiers exploiting an empty doorway rather than to any grand assault, a humiliation that stunned French command and became a rallying cry for the brutal, months-long campaign to retake it. That was the first stupid thing, stripping the strongest fort on the front to reinforce weaker ones. The second was leaving the door unwatched while they did it. France's mightiest fort didn't fall to an army. It fell to 20 men and an open door. Men and an open door. Built across a chain of islands to guard the approach to Helsinki, Sveaborg was known across Europe as the Gibraltar of the North, bristling with cannon across its bastions and manned by a garrison large enough, on paper, to make any assault costly, its construction having consumed enormous sums from the Swedish treasury over decades. Swedish planners considered it the linchpin of their entire Baltic defense. The fortress meant to guarantee Finland would never fall easily to Russian pressure. During the Finnish War, Russian forces laid siege, but the fortress's fall had less to do with Russian firepower, which never seriously breached the defenses, and more to do with its own commandant. Karl Olof Kronstedt surrendered the entire fortress in May 1808, with barely a shot exchanged, a decision widely suspected at the time to involve Russian bribery, family pressure from relatives serving on the Russian side, and outright defeatism rather than any real military necessity, a suspicion that has never been fully resolved by historians. Sweden lost Finland in large part because of that single surrender, a loss that reshaped the balance of power in the Baltic for the following century. Sweden built the Gibraltar of the North. One commandant handed over the keys before it was even properly tested. French engineers built Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island to guard the approach to Quebec and the whole of New France, earning it the nickname the Gibraltar of the New World, and drawing on the very latest in Vauban-style fortification theory imported directly from France. Its walls faced the sea, where heavy guns commanded the harbor entrance with overlapping fields of fire meant to shred any fleet attempting a direct approach. The one direction nobody fortified properly was land, because nobody expected an army to bother landing troops on the exposed, rocky coastline and marching in on foot through terrain considered too difficult for a serious campaign. New England militia did exactly that in 1745, coming ashore away from the guns and taking the fortress from behind in a campaign many in Europe dismissed at the time as an amateurish colonial gamble that shouldn't have worked. France rebuilt and reinforced it afterward, confident the lesson had been learned and the landward approaches properly addressed this time. In 1758, a British force under Geoffrey Amherst and James Wolfe landed troops on the same exposed coastline through brutal surf that nearly capsized several landing boats, and repeated the same flanking approach almost move for move, forcing Louisbourg's surrender a second time after a prolonged bombardment. France fortified Louisbourg against the sea twice. The second failure looked exactly like the first. Allied troops had already turned Tobruk into a legend in 1941, holding the port through months of siege as the self-styled Rats of Tobruk. a nickname they wore with defiant pride after Axis propaganda meant it as an insult. And by 1942, the garrison and its commanders treated the position as a proven fortress, a place that simply did not fall no matter what was thrown at it. That reputation outran the defenses actually in place to back it up, with minefields thinned, wire in poor repair, and units rotated in who lacked the hard-won familiarity of the original defenders. In June 1942, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps struck at a sector of the perimeter that had been left comparatively weak after months of complacency, breaking through faster than anyone inside expected and pushing armor directly toward the town before a coherent counterattack could be organized. South African General Hendrik Klopper, overwhelmed and cut off from clear orders as communications broke down across the perimeter, surrendered the garrison within a day, roughly 35,000 men taken prisoner in one of the most stunning Allied losses of the North African campaign. Winston Churchill called it a disgrace he could barely process while standing in front of an American president, learning of the fall in the middle of a meeting at the White House. Tobruk had already proven it could survive a siege. It had never proven it could survive a rumor of its own invincibility. Known as the Rock, Corregidor Island guarded the entrance to Manila Bay with heavy coastal guns mounted in fixed batteries and a honeycomb of tunnels, including the vast Malinta Tunnel Complex, built to keep a garrison fighting no matter what happened above ground and to shelter a hospital, headquarters, and supply depots deep underground. American and Filipino commanders treated it as the last, unbreakable anchor of the Philippine defense, even after Bataan fell in April 1942, sending thousands of exhausted survivors streaming across the strait toward the island as a last refuge. Corregidor's guns, like Singapore's, were built to fight an enemy coming from the sea, calibrated for naval targets rather than an assault launched from land just a few miles away. Japanese artillery batteries on Bataan simply bombarded the island for weeks from land, a relentless, grinding bombardment that reduced much of the surface fortifications to rubble and forced the defenders deeper into the tunnels, while troops crossed the narrow strait at night in small boats to land where the defenses were thinnest. Under relentless shelling and with no hope of relief from a Pacific fleet still recovering from Pearl Harbor, General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered on May 6, 1942, closing out the last organized American resistance in the Philippines and beginning years of brutal captivity for the men taken prisoner. Corregidor had tunnels deep enough to survive anything. It just couldn't survive being outflanked twice in the same war. 27 fortresses, plus the bonus few that almost made the cut on their own. 27 men certain the plan had no hole in it, and every one of them wrong in a way that looks obvious only in hindsight, from the comfort of a video essay 2,000 years later. A door, a jungle, a forged letter, an unpaid wage, a cliff nobody climbed, a fort nobody finished paying for, a shift change somebody watched closely enough to time. The walls were never the weak point. The confidence was. Every one of them had followers who believed it too. Engineers who signed off on the plans, generals who staked their names on the guarantee, kings who slept soundly the night before the wall came down. So which one got you? The open gate at Constantinople or the 20 men walking into Fort Douaumont? Tell us in the comments. If you want the next 27, you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe, and don't build your own Maginot Line around one idea you're too proud to double-check.